Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 10 p.m. I am Chris Weave. Welcome to Starfleet Tactical. And let's see, what else do I have to say about that tonight? I'm solo tonight. Lissa is off. She's actually has some gaming stuff to do. Pat is currently hopefully sound asleep in a hotel in Atlanta because he has to get up early tomorrow. The Navy's going to make him run around in circles or something like that, as they frequently do if you're in the Navy. And so basically, I've got the show all by myself tonight. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that I said that I would talk about previously, but I'm not going to jump quite in as much as possible. But of course, it wouldn't be Starfleet Tactical without me starting off by saying that, it's become kind of a gag, hasn't it? I am not speaking for any of my employers, past, present, or maybe future. I suppose I'm willing to grant the idea that maybe there's the possibility that at some point in the future I'll speak for an employee, but at this point I'm not speaking for anybody. So hello, Donnie. Hello, Claude. Hello, everybody else. I see we have the usual suspects here, so that's good. Glad to hear it. Let's see. So a little bit about what's gone on this week. So I ran an online conference called Connections Online. It's a wargaming conference. That was Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Lissa helped me out, and Merle Robinson, who sometimes shows up in the chat, was part of it also. And Brant Guillory, who you may have noticed that I sometimes do stuff with Brant, also on YouTube. And so at some point I'll send you all the links. I'll post it in chat or something like that once it goes to public. But it was a good conference. We had a few minor hiccups here and there, but it's the second year doing it, and it worked out pretty well. So I was pretty happy with that. I was also happy with the fact that, despite the fact that in the room where I was in for a 2-day meeting, 7 people tested positive for COVID. I have not been one of them, and I've had 3 tests so far, so that's good news. So hopefully we'll keep that going. But with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm almost tempted to say that this is going to be a short show. But I'm also very aware that every other time I've said that it's been going to be a short show, it's been a normal length show. So who knows? We'll find out. Okay, so let's add that. So part of the problem with me being solo is that I have to it's sort of hard to be up on stage and in the control room at the same time. So it means that at one point or another, I have to say, hold on a second while I do the other thing. So in any event, a few announcements, still behind in the comments. Some of them I'm going to try to get to comments tonight so that I don't go any farther behind before we finish. But I'm still behind in some of the other shows, and I've got some other bookkeeping and sort of things that I want to do. I was talking with Stogie the other day, who sort of runs the YouTube channel for Alec, and we were talking about what we can do to sort of segregate stuff and make it a little bit easier to find stuff, and et cetera, et cetera. So we're thinking away. We're thinking about ways to do that. But I'm still behind in at least the comments so far. So there's probably going to be no show next week. Let's talk schedule a little bit. Probably no show next week, the 30th of April, because Pat thinks he's going to be unavailable, and I'm probably going to be at a science fiction convention. Now, that might change. But the thing is, I probably won't find out if it's going to change until Friday, probably Friday morning. Late Thursday is the earliest that I would know whether that was going to change or not. And even then, it probably still makes, who knows? I've got a few health things that are sort of getting in the way of being able to participate quite as much as I would like. And, prudence dictates that that I'm probably not going to be able to do it. Hopefully I'm feeling well enough to go to the con, but who knows? I might not even do that, depending upon what the doctor says about stuff. Nothing particularly serious. But hello, Delon. How are you? There's probably going to be no show on the 7th of May. That one's actually less likely that there will be no show because I'm going to be in Des Moines. I'm going to be at a science fiction convention, but I realized after I wrote this slide up that I don't have to rely on the hotel internet because the hotel is actually fairly close to DeLon's house. So I might just zoom over to DeLon's house, do the show, and then go back to the hotel. If I'm at that con, that may also change. Once again, depending upon what my doctor has to tell me. Maybe having a show the week after. I may be traveling. I may be in Vegas, Nellis Air Force Base, or I might not. I don't know yet. Pat doesn't know what his schedule is that far out. The week after, I may still be out in Vegas, but I don't know yet, and Pat doesn't know that far out. The week after that, I may be back in Des Moines. That's actually, if that all works out that way, then chances are I'll be able to do it from DeLon's house. But the upshot is that if the next month, starting next week, happens the way that I think the way that it's been scheduled, my availability is kind of dodgy. If it doesn't happen the way that it's scheduled, it could either be for personal reasons or it could be because for job reasons. If it's for job reasons, hey, I'm great. I'll be doing the show a bunch. If it's for personal reasons, who knows? I may not be. DeLon says he'll be available for that show, so that's good. If I'm available, he'll be available. I'd like to remind everybody, I said last time that I'm going to go and reread the Exordium series by Dave Trowbridge and Sherwood Smith, available on Amazon or Bookview Cafe, and I'll probably do a couple of things on it, a couple of presentations on it. So this is an opportunity of one form or another. It's either an opportunity to see the presentations first and then make the decision about whether you want to read the books, or it's an opportunity to see the presentation, read the books and then, be well versed in the background for the time when the presentation happens, or it's an opportunity to do neither of the above. And also, we talked about doing a Babylon 5 watch along. The plan is sometime in June, Pat and I will talk about the first half of season 1. And we're going to do the entire first half of season 1 because there just isn't that much combat in the first season of Babylon 5, but we don't want to just skip the first season and go to the part that has more combat. So after that, we're going to have to, after the first season, I'm going to have to sit down and sort of figure out where the big lumps of combat are and perhaps, bin the things appropriately. But the plan is that we'll try to have a conversation about Babylon 5 once a month until we're done with the series. So as usual, the usual caveats. I already said my opinions, not my employer's. I'd like to emphasize nothing I say should make you not enjoy something you currently enjoy, right? That has the potential to be relevant in the next couple of weeks, in the next couple of presentations I'm going to do. Okay, so let's see. I'm looking through comments really quick. If I do make it out, I may very well go back. I went to the petting zoo the last time. I got to pet all sorts of exotic creatures like a MiG-29 and a MiG-23, a couple of MiG-23s, and a Hind helicopter, and a couple of surface-to-air missiles and some other things like that. So I did not actually sit in the cockpit of any of the aircraft, although there is a ladder up the side, or stairwell up the side. I could have, as it was, I leaned over and took pictures of the cockpits because the Russians do weird stuff. First of all, it's that weird blue-green color that they so love for the inside and sometimes the outside of the airplanes. And the second is the way they mount the throttle is just bizarre. To anybody who's used to how a Western throttle is mounted. At some point, I'll throw those pictures up on a slide and throw them up, but I don't have them on this computer. So, okay, let's see. Let's hide that. I'm going to go to the next slide. So this is going to be I've said I might as well go to the next slide. This is going to be a prelude to this handful of documents that I find myself rereading on a regular basis. I've mentioned these last time. Harris Landing's Naval Battle, which comes from May 1933. Karl Lautenschlager's Technology and the Evolution of Naval Warfare, which was an article in International Security. And I think it was International Security back in the day. This is like 1980s. And the Dreadnought Revolution Reconsidered, which was a conference paper. Julian Corbett's The Green Pamphlet, which is usually attached on the end of some principles of maritime strategy. Trent Hone has several publications that were about the evolution of fleet tactical doctrine in the interwar period. I'm going to basically go through one of the papers there. And Martin Doherty's Sector Fleet, which is a traveler product, but has some really, really interesting implications for science fiction. Most of these are historical, right? All except that last one, they're all historical. And I want to talk about them, starting with Lanning. And tonight I'm going to do some of the setup for that. It's not the actual talk itself, but it's some of the setup for that. So why do I care about this stuff? And why should I talk about this stuff on Starfleet Tactical? I mean, the reason why I care is that I'm a naval analyst by training. I've been doing it for the last 20 some years. So why do I particularly care about these things in the context of Star Trek and the context of science fiction? Well, the answer is that these are things that explain how the world works. And so they get you thinking about, they help you work through, at least they help me work through the model that I have for the real world. And that model is an interesting thing to compare because you can compare it to Star Trek, Starfleet. You can compare it to other science fiction. You can see if they've, you know, they naturally lead to particular questions. And even if you conclude this model doesn't fit, that's interesting in and of itself, right? Because a lot of the way that science fiction gets done, a lot of the way that Star Trek gets done is just to take a naval metaphor of combat and just file off the serial numbers, add in space on the end, and call it and say, okay, so here's my space navy, right? So to the degree that Starfleet is a space navy, that's sort of how, I mean, it's got cruisers, it's got dreadnoughts, it's got destroyers, it's got a lot of things like that. And so, you know, they clearly knew about the naval stuff there. And so to what degree do we think that naval stuff actually applies? If you're writing science fiction, you know, and you've decided that you want to file the serial numbers off, understanding exactly how those models work can make your stuff seem more realistic. Understanding how the models don't work can make your stuff seem more realistic too, as if you change those parts of the model. So you have to kind of understand how all that stuff works. And these are the ones that I go back to because every time I go back there, I go, wow, that's a really good point, and it helps me understand stuff a little bit better. All right. So I'm going to go back and let's see, Logic's Finest asked. I don't know okay, so it says, this is funny, at the online conference, somebody made the comment, you need to do a better job of reading the question before answering it because some people are just listening. And every time I hear that comment, I realize I need to do that. Every time I listen to my own show, because I usually listen to it on my iPhone as I'm walking around the neighborhood getting some exercise. I'll listen to it and I'll go like, I didn't repeat the question. So I'm going to repeat the question. Is the Gerald R. Ford, this is the new aircraft carrier that the Navy is just getting ready to commission or getting ready to deploy, I think, ready for deployment yet? I'm personally excited about the future it represents as far as new technology. So I think they're getting ready to actually deploy it. I seem to recall that its first deployment's on the schedule, and it's something like in the next 6 months or so. I don't remember, but there was an announcement to that effect relatively recently. So let's talk a little bit about Gerald R. Ford. About why is this carrier important? Why should we be building a new carrier? Why don't we just turn the crank and turn out another Nimitz? I mean, we built lots of Nimitzes. We can just turn the crank. What's the new one do? Well, first of all, I wondered that question too. Excuse me. Okay. I wondered that question too, and so part of the deal there was I ended up talking to a guy I see on occasion. I like a group of people that I hang out with usually once a year. In fact, it's the last social activity I did before COVID hit. And one of them works in the carrier office at NAVSEA. And I said, okay, so what's the big deal here? Tell me why this matters. And I'd heard some of the stuff. Like I had heard, for instance, that the flight deck arrangement is a little bit more conducive, that they think the flight deck arrangement is more efficient. And you'll notice over time, go back and look at the World War II aircraft carriers and the immediate post-war aircraft carriers, everything up through the Forrestal, starting with the Forrestal class, and you've got 4 elevators, one that's forward of the island, 2 aft of the island. Then with the Nimitz class, there's 2 forward of the island and 1 aft of the island, and they've moved the island back. With the Ford class, they've moved it back even farther. And that has to do with the fact that if you're storing airplanes to the back and you want to move them into position to launch them, you have to move them across the landing strip. But if you store them up forward, they're ready to go off the bow cats. And so if they're launching and recovering aircraft at the same time, which they frequently do, it's more efficient to have that extra space up front. So in some ways, it's a better parking lot. It's also better from the standpoint that the electromagnetic catapults on the aircraft carrier can be dialed more finely than the steam catapults can on the Nimitzes. The steam catapults inherently give a really big jerk at the beginning, and then they sort of taper off as you get towards the end. I mean, that's I've never been able to really sort of figure out. Never run into anybody who knows what exactly the maximum G-force is when you go off the carrier. You feel it. You definitely feel it. It's very interesting, but because it's not steady, it's not, you can calculate, you know how fast it takes to get from point A to point B, you know what that length is, so you can calculate an average, but you can't calculate the max because it's not a steady pull. Well, first of all, that electromagnetic catapult will give you a steady pull. That has the advantage that it doesn't put as much wear and tear on the airplanes, and as a result, the airplanes will last longer. And so they're thinking they're going to recoup some of the costs just by the fact they don't have to replace the airplanes as much. So they'll be able to get more out of them. The second thing is you can dial it down lower. There's sort of an inherent minimum for that steam catapult. And the more and more unmanned vehicles you have, they're generally smaller and lighter. And they'll really take a lot of punishment. In fact, you have to really beef them up much more than you would considering their size, just so that they can survive the catapult. And so it'll be a lot better from that. And then I sort of kind of figured out most of that. There was a piece that I hadn't figured out though. Yeah, that's good to throw up. There's a piece I hadn't figured out though, which is if you go into the hangar deck of a Nimitz, the hangar deck is sort of split into thirds. And about the last third of it, maybe the last quarter of it, there's a lot of test gear that's there. Because over time, they've added gear. And it's gear for things like testing engines and stuff. It's gear that you have to be able, you may not have to bring an entire airplane up to the gear, but you have to bring like an engine up to the gear in order to test it. There are places that they could have put that gear aft, but the problem is there isn't a good way to get the big things they're testing to those places. Right there, they'd have to do a huge amount of hot work, cut through a lot of bulkheads, et cetera, and they just said, it's just not worth it. So basically what they're going to do is that all that test gear stuff for engine maintenance, et cetera, is not going to be in the hangar bay. It's going to be aft somewhere back there. And they've created the lines of approach so they can move engines and stuff to the place where they need to take them in order to do the tests. As a result of that, all that gear comes out of the hangar bay. And so it's like they just got a hangar bay that's 50% bigger than the one that they had, because the 1/3 of the hangar bay that was clobbered is going to go away. So they're, 50% more room to work with. So it makes, I haven't sat down and sort of did the cost benefit analysis, but it's one of those things where you should assume that professionals know what they're talking about, right? one of the lessons I've learned over the years is that if a professional says something along the line, it says something and you go, I don't, that doesn't sound right to me. You should be asking the question, what about this do I not understand? And not just automatically assume that the professional is wrong, because he probably isn't. Okay, let me take a look through some of the other things here. Yeah, let's see. TJ has a good comment. It's actually a 1960s design. The Nimitz came out in 1968, if I remember correctly. So if you think it's probably a 1963 was probably when they put pen to paper. No later than that, actually. It's probably earlier than that. So it's a 1960s design. So let's see. I don't know what the plan is for basically defense weapons, lasers and stuff like that. I mean, I know that the Navy just had a test, which I've read the headline for, but I haven't read any articles on it, with an all-electric laser. I mean, that's one of the issues they've had in the past is volatile chemicals and stuff to get your laser fire. You can, one of the benefits of a laser, if it's all electric, is that you never run out of ammo. But if you've got to use, caustic chemicals in order to generate the laser pulse, you can run out of that. So you do run out of ammo for those sorts of things. So the Navy's apparently working their way through that. I don't know what the current status of that is, though. Let's see. Okay, so FYI, I just blocked somebody who's been causing problems. So he's gone. Let's see. Well, I hope she enjoys her time aboard. I've been pierside. Bunine at one point we had a meeting in Norfolk, and we were able to get on base because a bunch of us, had DoD credentials. So we were able to get on base, and we got onto the pier, and we talked with some of the people on pier side, et cetera. Couldn't go on the ship, but we got to walk down the pier and see it, and look at the bow. The bow actually looks a lot different than the lines are different. I mean, from a distance, you look at it and go, oh yeah, it's a Nimitz. They just moved the island back and did some stuff with the elevators and added a couple of pizza boxes on the end. But up close, it actually doesn't look like a Nimitz. It doesn't look like a Nimitz at all. We were able to look at two different. There was a Nimitz like on the other side of the pier, so we were able to like take a look at the front and then walk over and take a look at the front of the other one, and yeah, they're not the same. So. Yeah, they kind of gave up on the railgun, actually, which they gave up on the railgun, and they gave up with the new munition, which sort of surprised me because they came up with a railgun round, and they said that, then they said, well, we can use this with powder guns, and we can get like 80% of the capabilities of a railgun by just buying new ammunition for the powder guns. And then they gave up on that round too. And I don't know why. I do know that the round was not very large. I mean, that's why it was able to go so far so fast, is that basically it wasn't quite a discarding sabot sort of thing, but it was the same sort of idea that you fire something big out of a gun, out of a 5-inch gun, but it's actually kind of a small thing, so it'll go a long distance. Same sort of idea. But you can't you end up putting everything in that ends up being kinetic. And so sometimes that's not the right answer. Sometimes you want it to go boom, even if it's not moving very fast. So I don't know how many carriers are on mothballs. There are some. I don't know how many, and I don't know what it would take to get them back. So, if that ends up happening, that's not something that you just sort of say, hey, I need a carrier next week, go get it. Because I know what the decommissioning process is. You have to drain everything. Pete Gold talked a little bit about all the stuff that they have to do to decommission one of his ships. And so like you end up to mothball something, you have to like weld all the sea chests shut, you have to drain all the lubricants out. And then when you bring it all back, you know, basically anything that's a rubber hose has to be inspected and probably replaced. And you have to, you know, recharge everything that, you know, that has Freon or hydraulic fluid or whatever, et cetera. It's a big hassle to do it. Wright says that he thinks that only Enterprise is left. Now, Enterprise is not mothballed, I think. I think the plan is just to dispose of her. I don't think they're mothballing her. I know somebody who was aboard Enterprise within the last year or two, maybe 2 years ago. So she's still in Norfolk. She's decommissioned, but they still have people. There's still nuclear reactors on board. There's still people that are on board. And you know, most of it's sort of cold and dark, but not all of it. And so I don't know what its current status is, but you know, they kept that ship around for as long as they did because it was going to be so expensive to decommission. They kept talking about decommissioning it, and every time they did that, they'd say that, you know, somebody would hand the chief of naval operations the bill, and he'd look at it and go, "Oh my God, yeah, we'll just refit her." I did an exercise once where Building 65, USS Enterprise, was supposed to be the command ship. She was supposed to go to sea with us, but she didn't because she was 18 months into a 6-month refit or something like that. Because every time she went into the yard for like a 6-month refit, it would end up taking like 2 or 3 years because they'd find stuff. And it was just issue. I mean, it was an old ship. I mean, it's older than I am, right? So it was an issue. It was an issue. It had a very interesting steam plant. I mean, all the nukes I know love the steam plant because it had 8 nuclear reactors, and you could send steam from any nuclear reactor to any part of the rest of the plant. So from that standpoint, it was really cool, but it was still sort of problematic. So. Not cut up yet. So once again, I'm forgetting to read stuff. Logic's Finest says CVN 65 was the Enterprise that was cut up. It hasn't been cut up yet. It's decommissioned, but it's not cut up. Okay, so let's see. I'm now going to go on to the next slide, which is, let me hide that. This is actually the last slide I've got for this evening. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about as sort of a scene setter for talking about Harris Lanning's paper about surface navies of the early 20th century, of the time period that he was talking about, versus Starfleet. So let me dial back a little bit and talk a little bit about Harris Lanning in the paper. Harris Lanning was president of the Naval War College in the early 1930s. He had been a student there about 10 years before. He comes to the War College and he discovers that his thesis paper, it was part of the curriculum. They had liked it so much that they used it as part of the curriculum. And he said, I'm going to revise that because I've done a lot of thinking about naval combat since then, and I can make it better. And so that paper, the revised version that he wrote, the version I have is dated May 1933, and it was used for some period of time as one of the required readings at the Naval War College. And so he was a very sharp guy. He understood that airplanes were the future, but nobody quite yet knew what they were capable of. But he talked about airplanes. He talked about submarines. He talked about naval combat in general. And most importantly, he talked about how to think about naval combat. And so that's why I really like it. The version I have was published in his autobiography called An Admiral's Yarn. It's published by the Naval Institute Press some time ago. It's out of print. I found a PDF online. I will put a PDF up someplace, like on Scribd or someplace, or Google Docs or something. I don't know. I need to figure out where I'm going to do that. But I'll try to do that by the next time I've got it, so I can actually put a URL up. Okay, so he's writing in May 1933 about naval combat, naval surface combat. And so the type of ships that he's talking about are battleships, cruisers, and destroyers as sort of ships that are in the main battle line, anti-submarine escorts, and aircraft carriers. And so he talks about, you've got the battle line and you've got the anti-submarine stuff around it, et cetera. Those are the type of ships that he's talking about. Starfleet is a little different. Starfleet varies by time, right? Because in the Starfleet corpus, we have everything from the time period of Enterprise to the time period of Voyager, which I don't really like getting into Voyager because Voyager, first of all, they're not anywhere near the rest of Starfleet, so it's not particularly relevant for the sort of conversations we have. And second, Voyager is the worst of the older shows, comparable to, I think, Discovery and Picard in terms of their ability to just sort of like throw decades of history out the window because the showrunner decided that he didn't give a shit. So from that standpoint, the important part there is that if you go from like Deep Space Nine on the far end to Enterprise and the near end to us, that's a huge amount of time. And Starfleet looks a lot different over time. But one thing that's pretty much in common is that those ships may have significant warfare capabilities, but they're not primarily conceived, with one or two exceptions, as being warships for Starfleet. They are, the Enterprise, the original Enterprise was a heavy cruiser, but it was also an exploration ship and had science labs and all this other stuff that you wouldn't find on a ship. So in that standpoint, you've got different types of ship, but it's always important to remember that Starfleet ships are not warships, first and foremost. Second of all, there's something, it's interesting if you think about the speed of the platform versus the weapon range, and also the speed of the platform versus the weapon speed. So naval ships of this era are relatively slow. And let's take a look at the Iowa-class battleship as sort of an exemplar. Now, that's a little bit wrong from a time period, right? The Iowa-class wasn't commissioned until the early 40s. This is an article from the 1933. It still works. And frankly, I'm just more familiar with the Iowa-class. I know the math better. But the Iowa-class is way extreme compared to how fast the battle line was. The Iowa-class could go about 32 knots. Let's call it 30 knots. Although realistically in practice, it's probably not going to go 30 knots most of the time if it's part of the battle line, because the American battle line was famously slow. And so those older ships are only going to do, 22, 23 knots, something like that. And it's funny, the only gun duel that we ever had with U.S. Navy battleships, it was all the old stuff. It was Jesse Oldendorf at Leyte Gulf. I forget the battle of something Strait, if I remember correctly. Jesse Oldendorf with a bunch of old ships, because the fast battleships were busy escorting the aircraft carriers. So it was the older, slower ones. But let's go with the Iowa for the math on this. The Iowa had the 16-inch 50 guns, naval artillery on the Iowa, could shoot about 20 nautical miles, right? Okay, can they hit at 20 nautical miles? Let's just forget about that for purposes of this. But they could shoot about 20 nautical miles. The Iowa class is capable of about 30, 32 knots. Let's just call it 30 knots. Okay, so what's the implication of that? If an Iowa class shoots directly forward as it's moving along at 30 knots, it will take 40 minutes for that ship to get to where that shell landed. 40 minutes. Now think about phasers and photon torpedoes and everything else you see in Star Trek for those weapons. The weapons, now the shell that it fires is relatively fast. It will travel that 20 nautical miles in like 30 seconds, something like that. It's, it's not going flat. It's going in a very high arc trajectory. I want to say the time of flight is like 30 seconds. I forget. I'd have to go look it up. If Chris Carlson were here, he'd know off the top of his head. Yep. Wright points out that it was the Battle of Surigao Strait. So So ships are very fast in the Star Trek universe. Now, of course, they've got two speeds. They've got warp speed and they've got sublight speed. And so their capabilities aren't necessarily comparable from one to the other. But as a general rule, that when they're going at warp speed, they're so fast that phasers can't be used. And when they're at sublight speed, the phasers are very fast, but they don't shoot very far, relatively speaking, compared to how fast the ships can go. And photon torpedoes can shoot when they're at warp speed, but they have a very limited range, and they have a very limited range when they're at sublight speeds. I mean, there's literally no equivalent of I fire a photon torpedo and it takes me 40 minutes to get to where it detonated. That just can't happen in Star Trek. And so that's one of the things keep in mind when you're thinking about how naval warfare and the naval surface warfare is slow. It's slow to develop. You've got time to analyze stuff, but not too much time, because while it's slow to develop it, you also have, you're slow. The enemy's slow, but you're slow. And it's sort of this stately ballet to get everything together. And then you've got things like, in Star Trek, this is another line that I was going to put in that I forgot. In Star Trek, your sensors can see pretty much everywhere. You see everybody coming, you see everything. One of the comments that's made is that, in a modern circa 1933 combat, you can't see all the ships in your formation. There's no place in the formation where you can see everything. And that's assuming that you don't have fog or mist or low light conditions or any of the other things that you're likely to have at sea. So you have just a situational awareness problem. And a lot of the stuff that navies would do in terms of tactics and doctrine are coping with the fact that they're slow and they have a situational awareness problem. And as a result, people have to know what to do without being told what to do, because they may be able to see stuff that their commander can't see. And they can radio back and say, hey, boss, I see X. I'm going to execute plan alpha, right? But they can't give all the details, right? They can't, the commander just has to sort of trust them. They can give some of the details, but the commander has to trust them that they're putting the picture together the right way. So speed of maneuver, it takes a long time for Navy surface forces to actually move around, to change formation, to change the orientation, we figured they're coming from this way, we have to swing the formation in that direction, etc. And so they spend a lot of time cruising around in formations that are designed so that if they need to make one of those things, they've already sort of started the process, right? You might have three lines that are in parallel to each other, three columns, so that when they turn in one direction or another, they're spaced out far enough that they sort of fall into line and they can form a battle line very easily. You don't really see that in Star Trek, right? There's no real equivalent of that. All those battles in Deep Space Nine seem to be like phalanxes of ships that were just in line abreast, and then they just go in and have a furball. So, and they did it moving very, very quickly. Combat takes place very fast in Star Trek universe. So fleet, I'm also going to talk about what I call fleet combat integration. How you do the ships work together. And I don't mean do they concentrate on a target, because that's how Starfleet does it. It's a low level of working together, but it's all like, Picard saying, target this part, target the trash compactor on the cube. Trust me on this one, it'll work. Right? It's all about things like that, and it's all about targeting. And sometimes it's about, the USS Dudley Moore is having problems, so let's go and try to help out the Dudley Moore by getting in between the thing that's pounding on the Dudley Moore and the Dudley Moore, so that they can have a chance to let their shields regenerate and stuff like that. So there's some stuff like that, but the thing is, you don't have what you see in navies of this time period, like the U.S. Navy, where there is a division of labor, right? The purpose of destroyers is to keep the other guy, to prevent him from not being able to optimize his gun line, right? And you've got the guys that have the big guns, and they're the guys that are going to win the battle, and you've got the escorts that they got their various functions, and everybody's got a job to do. And it's not just like The way Starfleet does that is, okay, everybody's got phasers, so everybody with phasers goes in and shoots their phasers. And that ship has a lot of phasers and really good shields, so it's going to lead the way, and then everybody else is just going to come in and they've got phasers and shields too, right? There isn't really that specialization that you see. Now, you occasionally see it in the write-ups, you see it in the fan-based material, etc., but you don't really see it in the discussions that take place. You don't really see it on the screen. You don't see it, you just see it in other sources. Okay, so my tentative hypothesis is actually that Star Trek combat is more like air combat maneuvering than naval combat. So it's more like air combat, and it's specifically the part where you're shooting your watch, right? It's specifically the air combat maneuvering part. It's the part after the merge. So what's the merge, right? You've got this part where the opposing forces are coming at each other. Some of that's beyond visual range. That's all about radars and long-range sensors and how can I, where do I put my nose and when do I fire long-range missiles, etc. The merge is the part where it turns into a dogfight. The merge is the part where they pass each other and, they pass each other and everybody yanks on the stick and does a maneuver, right? So the merge is sort of the break point of sort of there's the before part and there's the after part. So I should note, I'm know more about naval combat than I knew about air combat, but I find air combat really, really interesting because I think for science fiction purposes, a lot of air combat has a lot to offer for science fiction and it's untapped in that regard. So for instance, they have a specific vocabulary, the air guys have a specific vocabulary that takes into account things like the range of a missile depends upon the altitude and the speed of the firing platform, right? Because you add that delta V on. So when you see that the speed of a missile is such and such, okay, yeah, they got a top speed in that at some point aerodynamic heating is going to prevent them from going any faster, right? There's going to be, they're eventually going to get to the point where they can't go any faster because of drag, but ask any fighter pilot, they'll tell you, I want to be high and fast when I'm loosing my long-range missiles because they can go farther and they'll have more energy when they get to the target. And that's what you're looking for in air-to-air combat. So they have lots of vocabulary that talks about, like, what's the point at which the enemy can't escape from my weapon? What's the point at which I can escape from his weapon and he can't escape from mine? They've got terms for all of those things. And so, like, I read Honor Harrington, the closest you have in Honor Harrington is the idea of a 0-0 intercept. But the thing that I see missing in Honor Harrington is I would expect there to be this long vocabulary that David would then have to spend 3 pages explaining the terms to you. But okay, that's what he does. He's good at it. But there should be this specific vocabulary because practitioners of something, especially warfare practitioners, develop their own vocabulary to talk about stuff. And they encapsulate a lot of complicated ideas about energy maintenance and relative speeds, etc., because it's all that stuff changes based upon altitude and speed. So it's not just this thing, the speed of this thing is such and such. It doesn't work that way. So I think that the analogy for air combat maneuvering is imperfect. Because there's some speed versus weapons stuff that I talk about above. All the weapons in the Star Trek universe are surprisingly short range. If you think about them in terms of like the number of seconds that they're around, they're long range. They're long range compared to anything that we've got, but they're really short range considering that we're talking about starships. We're talking about things that cover stellar systems in minutes or hours, right? And they, you don't see a whole lot of stuff. At least I don't recall seeing a whole lot of stuff that looks like beyond visual range pre-merge maneuvering. It really just sort of seems to be like, okay, they're over there, so we'll go over there. That's what I remember from Deep Space Nine. I need to do more study on this because I need to go back and rewatch a bunch of that stuff with this in mind, because I've learned a bunch of stuff since the last time I sat through all that stuff, all of like Deep Space Nine and Next Gen. So I need to go and take another look at it. So I may actually change my mind on this with further study, but my working hypothesis right now is that air combat maneuvering has an awful lot to offer. You look at some of those those combats, and they look like dogfights. They don't look like naval combat. They look like dogfights. I should also say the standard caveats apply because, like, which Star Trek am I talking about, right? In the past, I've talked about there's a handful of stuff that I really sort of look at, and then I run it through Sternbach and Okuda, and, I talk to Andy and Pat, and they tell me what they think about it, and their opinions carry a lot of weight with me. So in Star Trek, you can sort of pick and choose what you decide to build your own personal headcanon off of. I try to come up with stuff that is consistent with what I see in terms of the capabilities. I'm not as concerned with what I see consistent on the screen, because I don't think the on the screen stuff is consistent. I think anybody who's watched more than 3 episodes of Starfleet Tactical knows more about how combat in Star Trek works than anybody who actually wrote a script for Star Trek. Sternbach and Okuda knew an awful lot. The art department guys knew an awful lot. So they're the guys who tried to make sure all that stuff fit together and was consistent, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of just the people who came in and wrote episodes, I don't think they got it. I don't think they got it at all. So, but nothing I say should make you not enjoy something you currently enjoy, right? Alec last night mentioned Field of Dreams as being one of those movies he always watches when it comes on. I'm the same way. Field of Dreams is one of my favorite movies. There's not a damn bit in that movie that makes the least amount of sense. But that's okay, because it doesn't try to engage you on an intellectual level. It tries to engage you on an emotional level. And I can willingly suspend disbelief in situations like that. But, disbelief should be suspended, not lynched. So, all right, I'm going to go back and take a look at some of the comments we've got here. Scrolling back. Okay, probably not going to go back all the way. Okay, so I'm going to drop in on this. Logic's Finest was talking with TJ, and he said something about merely stating what the Navy has said during testing the Iowa class was speed tested at 34 knots. Yeah, that sounds right. That at the high end, the condition of the hull, the condition of the engineering plant at that particular time can make a lot of difference. Is the hull fouled? Has it been scraped recently, etc. It also, believe it or not, it also matters how deep the water is. If you're in if I remember correctly, in shallow water, you can go faster than you can in deep water. And it has something to do with the way that the pressure wave bounces off the seafloor and sort of gives you a push, if I remember that correctly. I talked last week about how, in shallow water, the ship will squat down. And I think that, if I remember correctly, that actually helps in this situation. Although if you do it, it does mean that there's a speed limit if the water is too shallow, because you can actually bang your rudders on the seafloor if you try going too fast in water that's too shallow. So there's all sorts of really interesting things that happen when the water gets shallow and you're trying to go fast. So yeah, and I don't think that all of the Iowa classes necessarily tested at 34 knots. One of them, if I remember correctly, did test faster than the others by like a knot. But, at the high end, you end up paying huge amounts to get extra knots at the high end, because you're dealing with hull form drag, and it's an exponential function. The drag goes up exponentially as speed increases, and you eventually get to the point where you just don't have the power to go any faster. And like you get to the point where you double the engine plant and you go a knot faster. So that's why sort of ships have a top speed of about 30-ish knots. And the ones that don't do that cheat And by cheat, I mean they decrease the amount of wetted area of the hull that's in contact with the water. And that includes things like hydroplaning, which is how PT boats did it. They basically get up on the narrow part of the hull. There's a small part of the hull down below, and they're basically just sort of riding up like a speedboat does. Or you have things like hydrofoils that cheat by having wings, and they lift most of the hull out of the water. So it's, let's see. Somebody said about eliminating the spammer. Yeah, I will eliminate the spammer if he continues to spam. Let me see if he continues to spam. Let's see. A question from Logic's Finest is that Star Trek movement a consequence of having to have all the action on screen at the same time? Ships are always close enough to touch each other. I think that is it. In fact, I seem to recall that they specifically talked about that because, like, if you go back, I actually conceptually prefer combat in the original series because if you recall, in the original series, combat takes place at warp. All combat took place at warp. They'd be closing in on each other with a combined warps. One's going warp 6, the other's going warp 5, and they're doing passes at each other. But whenever you saw phasers firing, you never saw. No, I'm going to back off of that. You rarely saw more than one ship in a frame at a time. You saw Space Station K7 and ships in frame. And the episode with the 3 Klingon cruisers, or 3 Romulan D7s that have surrounded the Enterprise, I believe there's a shot where you see all 4 ships. But none of the combat ships saw them together, and that's because they didn't really have the special effects technology. I mean, first you got to make sure that everybody's not blurry. So you've got issues with how do you do depth of field and have everybody not be blurry. And then on top of that, if you only show the Enterprise, you can just assume it's moving really fast and the camera's fixed on it. But if you're trying to show more than one ship and they're moving really fast, how do you do that? If they're moving faster than the speed of light and they're doing fast passes, how do you do that? Everything ends up looking like that fast pass, at best, that fast pass in the opening credits, where it's just a blur as it goes by, right? So next gen camera technology had improved, and they decided they wanted to put everything in the same frame. And I personally don't like that decision. I don't like what that ended up doing to combat. I much prefer things like how you see it work in Andromeda, where you see one ship fire, you see the other ship fire, you see the shots go past each other, the missile shots go past each other on a radar screen, and then you see the hits and the point defenses and all the other stuff, and they sort of go back and forth. Because if I remember correctly, those ships are like shooting from a significant portion of this across the solar system from each other. So you've got ships that are like in the orbit of Mars shooting ships that are in like the orbit of Earth, if I remember correctly. They're certainly much, much longer range. So that's why you see stuff like that. Yep. Dale points out that you do see 4 Constitution ships in a diamond formation before the Enterprise blows them up in the Ultimate Computer episode. So that's a good point. That's another instance. But, the thing is, they're all in formation. They're all moving in the same direction. They're not moving. Well, in that case, they just cut and pasted the same image multiple times, right? It's not like they had 4 models. They cut and pasted the same image multiple times. And because they were maintaining a perfect formation like that, they could do that. Screening vessel going above and beyond the USS Johnston on its torpedo run against the Japanese center force. I think they just, if I remember correctly, they just found the Johnston not too long ago, and it's like the deepest wreck anybody's ever found. That part of the Pacific is really deep. If you haven't seen there was a TV show called Dogfights, and they did an episode of Dogfights that was actually about ships, and they did one on Johnston and the destroyer escort. Johnston was a destroyer, and they did one on the destroyer escort also, whose name is escaping me right now. But that episode of Dogfights was just fantastic. It's definitely worth watching. And then the same group of people then did the the show that focused on the career of the USS Enterprise. That's escaping me. The name of it's escaping me right now. But they did an entire season of just the USS Enterprise in World War II, and it was fantastic. And that's one of the things where you really get an impression about how, we looking back on it from this distance don't really fully appreciate, first of all, how close together all those battles were in 1942. They fought Coral Sea. They fought Coral Sea, and then like a month later, they fought Midway, and it's the same guys. So it's not just we're going to fight the Japanese. It's like we're going to fight those assholes that we had to deal with last month. That's how they sort of viewed it. And when you take into account the fact that they're having to they're basically rewriting their tactics on a weekly basis. The air crew complement, the air wing complement that fought at Midway did not look the same as the air crew complement that fought at Coral Sea. They had more fighters on board because they learned the lesson of Coral Sea and they changed the composition of their air wing. And they would do that from battle to battle. In addition to doing it like, okay, we think we're going to be doing a lot of ground support, so now it's more about ground support. But they were mixing things up and writing tactics documents on a weekly basis. In that show, you really got a handle on that. And it's still, the name of it's still not coming to me. It's on my bookshelf. Before I leave, before we call it a night, I'll try to go over and take a look at it. Okay, so let's see. Lots of discussion. Yeah, Logic's Finest also. He's got all the good questions today. Ships take wide arcs when they should be turning in place as needed. They're in space. Battlestar Galactica did that brilliantly with the new version. Battlestar Galactica gets high points for some things, right? Babylon 5 gets high points for some things too, right? They have pseudo vector movement. I mean, I'm not convinced. It's sometimes hard to tell because it's hard to tell whether the camera is supposed to be moving too, or whether the camera is supposed to be stationary. I mean, clearly, and especially in Battlestar Galactica, the camera is supposed to be moving too. And so, but you can't really judge the movement of the camera. So it's sort of tough to tell sometimes what the ships are supposed to be doing. But in both of them, I suspect that if you actually plotted it out on graph paper, you would conclude that, yeah, they were kind of playing fast and loose with the vector movement. Now, that having been said, that's really sort of churlish on my part to even sort of mention it, right? Because the only reason I do is because I want people make sure that people understand that there's, don't think they got it perfect there. They got it really pretty good, and they're at least their heart's in the right place. Same with the Expanse. Their heart's in the right place when they do that stuff. All those shows have some issues, though. They're not perfect. My big issue with Battlestar Galactica is every Cylon Raider is effectively a kamikaze where the pilot doesn't die because they can just sort of translate back to the resurrection ship. So I don't understand why every Cylon Raider that shows up doesn't have a nuclear warhead in it and just rams the Galactica, especially since they've got a tactically useful FTL drive. They should be able to pop in far enough out, see the Galactica, and then say, okay, I'm 3 light minutes out. I see where they are. I can jump them, and I can be like inside their defenses and crashing into them before they even know I'm coming. You would think. That's one thing that none of those shows really talked about was light speed. Actually, The Expanse does. But Battlestar Galactica and Babylon 5, neither one of them ever mentions the words light speed lag, to the best of my knowledge, right? The speed of light, it takes a while to communicate. It takes a while to communicate. And by communication, it takes a while for information to pass. And that includes things like somebody just popped in. And so if I pop in 3 light minutes away from you and you've been there for an hour, I see you, but you don't see me for 3 minutes. Everything we see is 3 minutes times late, but you get to play that game. The Exordium series has a lot of that. That's a real hardcore portion of it. That's why I'm going to talk about it as a combat model. Yeah, Star Trek Combat seems to combine aerial fighting and sea combat, and it's all close to fit on TV screens. Yep, totally agree. Totally agree. Let's see. Yeah, Wright made the comment that most of the audience has some military or history background. It really sounds like that's the case, and that's perfectly fine by me. And I sort of view this as, that's part of the reason why I really like this group, is that it's a group that sort of gets it. That's good. Okay, scrolling. Yeah, Wright says something about the square cube law. Drock always talks about that on his channel. If you're not watching Drachinifel, Dracinifel, I think, he does some great naval history stuff. Just fantastic. He does ship stuff, specific about individual ships. He does stuff. It's worth watching. It's definitely worth watching. Okay, let's see. Scrolling. Yes. Yep. Wright commented about also damage control learned from Coral Sea with gas lines. Thank God the Yorktown had good people to figure out to put CO2 in the gas lines. Yeah, that's exactly what they did. Some I want to say lieutenant or lieutenant commander said, hey, what if we drain all the fuel lines and put CO2 into them? We could have a lot less fires. So that's what they would do. When they were going into combat, they drain the fuel lines and put CO2 in. And so if those lines got busted, they didn't have fuel spewing everywhere. That was a fantastic idea. So Bob points out that B5 ships definitely pivoted whatever orientation they wanted while momentum carries them in the original direction. Yeah, they did do a lot of sideways shooting and stuff like that, and that was pretty cool. The part I wonder about, though, is there are times where it seems like, they'll be thrusting along for a long period of time, and it's like, oh, I just got orders. I need to turn around and go back, and they flip the ship over, and then maybe it's a camera motion thing. Maybe they're actually decelerating for some long period of time and then beginning to accelerate in the other direction. But a lot of times it seems like if you just assume that the camera is an honest broker, it seems like they immediately start going in the other direction. So I'll give them high points for vector movement. I'll subtract half a grade for the fact that I think that it's not really vector movement. Rob asks if I ever read The Hegemony by Mark Kalina. I have not. FTL drives in Galactica do take time to spool up, Olive points out. Sorta. The human drives do, the colonial drives do, but you do see instances where a Cylon Raider pops in, and they see it, and then it immediately jumps out again. So the Cylon drives are way better than the colonial drives, and they can do stuff like that. Yeah, Bob points out that Battlestar Galactica with skip missile tech would have been a short series, and that's what I always dreamed of. Was so if you remember about Battlestar Galactica, all those first season episodes, they all take place over the course of like 4 days, right? The entire first season is just a couple of days worth, including the miniseries, right? Because they're just getting hammered and they're getting hammered and they're getting hammered. I would have liked to see at some point they back off and they just say, I see this scene that takes place with Adama and Ty, and Adama says, or Ty says, why aren't we dead? We should be dead now. They had us to rights, the light speed lag, blah, blah, blah. Why aren't we dead? And the other one says, yeah, I've been wondering about that. And that would have been the best place to introduce the idea that the Cylons have a plan, right? And so the plan isn't necessarily that they're trying to kill them. They're trying to herd them or something. And so that turns into the big mystery as to what the hell's going on, because they should be dead, but they didn't do that. Okay. Okay, let's see. Okay, and I think that takes me to the end. And I will note that I'm 5 minutes over. So, despite the fact that I said that I thought it might be a short show, it turned out it wasn't a short show. But like I said, it's unclear as to what's going to happen for the next couple of times. So, please, please, please check YouTube to see. I'll update the schedule, right? If I put a show up, it'll tell. One of the things I like doing is putting the show up early enough so that everybody can see what the date on the show is, and therefore you guys know if we're having a show or not. Now, Pat and I have talked about this, and we talked with Lissa about it, and haven't had a brief conversation with Alec about it. We need to do something else, right? There needs to be some other way to pass things along other than just you guys reading the tea leaves of when the next show is scheduled for. I'd like to be able to have like a calendar or something that everybody can point to or something. Well, I'm not quite sure how to do that yet. We're still thinking about ideas for that. So we'd like to do that in some way, because we realize that, as it is, we're communicating basically through the medium of YouTube. You get to see me, I get to see your writings in YouTube chat, and there's got to be sort of a more persistent way to have that comms. And I'm not sure exactly what that is. Maybe it's a Discord server, et cetera, et cetera. We're sort of thinking about it. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank everybody who came tonight. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to doing this again. Maybe it'll be next week. Maybe you won't see me until June. But regardless, have a good one, everybody. Bye.